Hi, this is Susan Hefner-Rama, clinical social worker here in Louisville, Kentucky. And again, this is another segment of the toolkit for the Kentucky Office for Refugees. And in this segment, I want to talk about how do we talk to refugees about mental health. This is a question I get a lot, so I'm going to take some time to really go through how I've developed some techniques for doing that. And so we're going to do first a review of refugee mental health. Very briefly, refugee mental health is a combination of several layers. It's the initial trauma or the traumatic experiences that a person experienced. Then it's the culture, a second layer of the context, how they view the world, how they understand the things, how they interpret the things that have happened to them through that cultural lens. And then the third is the acculturation process. Every refugee experiences acculturation, and the acculturation process is about learning who am I in this new place, and is a very difficult journey that I'm going to talk about more in a minute. But all these layers are on top of each other, and then we have to sift through them as mental health providers, sift through those layers to understand this person's context, the way they view the world, and therefore how to help them to move into a better place of mental health. So two pieces I'm going to do now. The first one is how I've talked to refugees as a whole, and this outline came through doing cultural orientation for refugees about being well, being healthy in the United States. And with the toolkit, there is a guide that you can follow, but I'm going to talk through it just a little bit to help you have a sense of why I do it this way. So the first thing I do, of course, is introduce myself and talk about that they are on a journey. They're on a path towards finding a place that they feel safe and welcome in this country. And so I tell them we're going to talk about transition, only this is a very big transition. And I ask them how many of you wanted to come to the United States, and they all raise their hand. Yes, I wanted to come. And then I say, okay, so you wanted to come, so that means it's easy now that you're here. And they all say, no, it is not easy. So then we talk about journey. I tell a little story about myself the first time I went abroad, entering a new place, and how difficult it was. I talk about how I cried, and they all connect to that story. So sometimes our own stories help us to illustrate, and you might have a story that you share that illustrates that process. So we're talking about transition. So I draw a big U on a board in front of them, and I talk about the left end of that as shock. And I ask them, what surprised you when you first got here? And people will share all kinds of things about how cold it was, or how clean it was, or something about the people being inside their homes and not being out on the street, or many things that begin to help us to hear and see the difference of perspective and worldview. So it's important to ask that question, what really surprised you when you first arrived to the United States? And I make a big list of those. Then I explain to them what integration is, the other end of this U-shaped diagram. The other end is integration. And I say integration means when your old culture and your new culture fit together in a way that makes sense for you, that you can go back and forth between them, and that makes sense. Your world makes sense. You can function with that. So then I ask them, how long do they think it will take before they feel like this? And if it's an older refugee, they'll say, I'll never feel like that. And if it's a young, strapping, hard-working young man, he might say, oh, I'm already integrated. It's different for everybody. It's important to talk about and have people acknowledge that there is this journey that they are on. So then I talk about the shape. What do we have here? We have this big valley. You can't jump over it. You can't fly over it. You know, we laugh about, you know, trying different things to avoid it. But we have to go through that journey. Now, some of you may have noticed, if I'm talking about this U shape, it's like a grief curve. And it really is. It's very similar, that one must go through acknowledging all that's lost from their old culture. And I must go through this hard work of getting to the other side. And so then we stop and we talk about what emotions are in here. And if they're a little hesitant, I may introduce some of those emotions that are normal for us to have. And I really emphasize how normal all those emotions are. Anger and sadness, resentment, hurt, feeling lost and overwhelmed and scared. All of those things are normal as we go through that transition. And then I begin to talk about the body. How does your body feel in this process? What is happening in our body as we face all these changes? And then I introduce the idea of stress. What is stress? What is good stress? How do we cope with stress? Maybe some healthier ways, like reading or studying or going out dancing, if that's part of your culture, or playing with my children, taking them to the park. All these things are good coping mechanisms. Exercise, walking. And then we talk about some of the things that maybe aren't as healthy about the ways that we deal with stress, like smoking or drinking or other kinds of things that aren't as productive. They're coping mechanisms, and we must cope, and coping is good, but maybe they're not the ideal mechanism for coping with stress. So then we talk about, what does it mean when that stress is too big? When do we know that someone is not just struggling with this normal process of going from shock to integration, but rather is really, really struggling? And so we talk about ways to differentiate what these normal emotions are. So a little bit of sleeping too much, some apprehension, fear, a little bit of anxiety symptoms that we might have. And then we talk about someone who can't get out of bed at all, doesn't want to do anything, isn't participating with any family activities, won't go to school or work, won't get up and help the family, just wants to stay in bed, or is out, running around with other groups of people to try to avoid being part of the culture. Those extreme behaviors like attaching oneself to gangs or other kinds of negative kinds of behavior, out drinking all night, those kinds of things. So we talk about what is in that normal framework and what is outside of that normal framework. So then I try to bring it all back together and talk about how in the United States we believe that there are times in our lives that the stress is just too big. And when that stress is just too big, that it's okay to ask for help, that that's a normal thing to do, and work to differentiate it from the crazy. You're all good or you're all crazy. To build some middle ground between stress and normal stress, and managing that stress and taking care of oneself, and the truly serious mental illnesses that exist, and begin to build more of an understanding of that in between, and that we take care of each other in this way, that we provide services, support, and you can go talk to someone. Basically, I then explain, you can come and talk to me, or you can go and talk to other people, and it's our job to help you find ways to live well here in America, and that there's nothing wrong with you for wanting to talk about what's going on, wanting to explore how these things are difficult, what these stresses are, and how to correct them. so that you can live a good life now that you're here in America. And so that begins to normalize the mental health process that we have and the offerings we have to provide services for refugees. It gives them a bit of a framework that starts to open up a variety of experiences and understandings about how we operate in society, and not just there's normal and then there's crazy. So we need to fill in that space a bit with language and with experiences that normalize and help a person feel like I can do this. Because there is that rich resiliency that we know every refugee has because they've gotten to this point. So how do we help them to expand that view? The wonderful thing about this process is that I would ask them, what will it look like when you are integrated in this society? And they mention things like, I have a house, I have a car, I feel safe, I get an education. I'm able to manage the day-to-day activities of my life. And my favorite one that I got is, I will be in a place where I can do good things for other people. Now, if that isn't a refugee perspective that brings us back to the beauty of the people that come here and the things that they bring with them and how they contribute to our society, when I will know that I'm integrated and acculturated, when I can begin to do good things and give back to other people. We talk to refugees about mental health. I've talked a little bit about how I would do a cultural orientation that was for lots of people in groups exploring that acculturation process. But I want to talk a little bit more about how I might engage an individual when maybe they're coming into my office or I'm meeting them somewhere and they have some challenges that I'd like to be able to help them with. And so I want to identify 3 things. First is language. We need to think about the language we use. We use a lot of language in English. We say lots of things that are unnecessary parts of sentences. We speak a lot. And that has to do with being what's called a low context culture, where we talk a lot about things and explain things a lot. And some of those words, some of that is unnecessary. Of course, also mention language, because language is, we're probably using an interpreter, or maybe they're wanting to speak in English because they do have English, but their language might be a little limited compared to what we use, as well as medical terms, all of the complex words that we might use. We need to get rid of those, and we need to bring it down, not because people are stupid, but we need to bring it down into simple terms that are understandable and translatable, so that people can connect to what we're talking about, not being far off by using lots of technical language. And that's one of the things that technical language does, and this gets into being trauma-informed. We use that technical language to distance ourselves from people. And if we want to be culturally competent and we want to be trauma-informed, we need to use language that connects. It's easier for us to have a conversation about. That's really, really important in refugee mental health work. The second thing is context. Understanding where that person has come from. If you don't know before you meet them, certainly after you meet them, you want to go and do some research and find out what is the context of how they got here. If you work just with refugees, you get a better sense of that. You get an idea of what people have been through. But if you're a provider out in the community and don't connect with a lot of refugees, you want to know and understand, what was that journey process like for them? What are some of the possibilities of things that may have happened to them? Could they have been sexually assaulted? Could they have been tortured? Learning to understand what that was lost in that journey process? What resources have been given over so that they could come to the United States? These are very important. And normalizing much of that process. Normalizing not the process, but normalizing the impact of that. That the response to that trauma is a normal response. Bessel van der Kolk and others say that trauma is a normal response to an abnormal event. So what happens to us after a trauma is very normal. The third piece is not having any assumptions. You cannot go into a conversation with any assumptions about the person or their experiences. And if you've done that research, that's great, but be careful not to lay assumptions on that person, that individual, because of a broader series of events or understandings about what happened or where a person has come from. So it's very important. Go back to the cultural competency piece and remember that we have to enter with an openness, a flexibility of mind, and a great deal of humility. So, many cultures outside the United States, particularly where refugees come from, have the understanding that I am crazy or I'm good, and there's not a lot of in between. In the previous segment, I talk a little bit about how to begin to build in a better understanding of all of that happens in the middle. The normal range of sadness and fears and the impact that trauma can have on us, and the acculturation process that are still very much normal responses, and that as mental health providers we can do things to help a person cope, because how I introduce all of this is that I'm going to demonstrate a little bit about how I would talk to a person. You know, I say, good morning, good afternoon, my name is Dr. Susan. I'm glad to meet you today. We have about an hour or so to talk, and I'd like to hear more about what your life has been like since you arrived to the United States. That focus on the functioning and the now, not asking about the past. That might be covered later. You might get more of that history. But right now, I want to hear about how you're doing right now that you're in the United States. And then I explained that something like my job here at the clinic is to help you find your way to a life here in America that is the way you would like to live, to find the best way of living for you and your family here in the United States. And then I'll say something like, because you came here as a refugee, I know that there were things that happened that were not good things. And when bad things happen to us, we expect to get to the United States and everything's going to be easy and good, but it's not. We're looking for an easier life. And in fact, we still have a lot of work to do to be safe and feel comfortable here in the United States. And so part of my job is to help you figure out what you need to feel comfortable here now that you're in the United States. I talk about how in the United States we believe that when there are challenges, when we're stressed and we feel challenges or obstacles in our life, that we talk to other people about that. Maybe we talk to our family, but sometimes we also go and talk to someone who's outside of our life that helps us reflect on how we can, what things we can do to help find that journey towards that comfortable life. Because those stresses are normal stresses that we experience. Then I talk about what happens in our brain. I talk about how when bad things happen to us, our brain wants to protect us. And our brain, back here, the brain stem of part of our brain is the part that says, whoa, wait a minute, that's a bad thing. We need to protect ourselves. This is what the brain and the body is doing. And so we either run or we fight or we hide. Hide or freeze, however you want to talk about that. And I talk about how that's a good brain. A good brain is saying, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't good. Let's protect us. Let's run. Let's fight. Or maybe we freeze and hide. So I go on to say, so when really bad things have happened, or a series, many bad things have happened, that our brain changes the way it operates to try to protect us from more bad things happening. That protection in the brain gets really strong and prominent, and it's coming forth all the time rather than just when there really is a bad thing. In fact, maybe our teacher in English class asks us to respond to something in English, and we begin to feel that what we call arousal. We begin to feel that protective response come forth. So the work that I do, this is what I tell them, the work that we will do together is to help that part of the brain to calm down a bit, and then the relaxation part of the brain, which is the other part of that system, to find ways to help that part of the brain remember how to relax again. How do I find relaxation and find a way out of that cycle of the protective response? And it's my job to help you walk through that process. So then I will begin, I'll ask them if they understand, are things making sense, do they have questions, of course, as we go through every once in a while. The way I ask questions is not to just say, do you understand, so that there's yes or no, but rather, can you tell me about this, or tell me what I said about that, so that there's more interaction to make sure that they really are understanding and not just nodding their heads saying yes. So then I'll introduce the idea that this process causes changes in our body. It's our brain, but also our body. And I'll say, now I'm going to ask you some things about what's happening to you each day. And I will ask, does your heart ever start to beat really, really quickly? Oh, yes, yes. I'll ask them, do you have headaches? Do you have problems with your stomach? Do you have nausea or discomfort in your stomach? I'll ask, do you have difficulty sitting still for long periods, or sometimes you feel like you can't sit still? I'll ask them if they see things in their mind that happened in the past, things that they remember suddenly come into their mind in the middle of watching television or going to the bank or going to work. Do they worry too much? Do they have too much worry? Do they ever find that their mind is going far, far away and they can't, they suddenly realize that it's at time, lots of time has passed and their mind has been far, far away. These are all things that are part of our traumatic stress response. And so I try to ask it in ways that make sense in their daily living. We're going to we're going to focus then on functioning. How does one function? And what are those things that interfere with the capacity to function? What symptoms then are causing it to be difficult for me to get on the bus and go to work or go to school or take care of my children? And those are the things that we function on, and we focus on initially what the function of the refugee is. Some of you may be familiar with the flip your lid, the description that is used sometimes for children. I think that can be very helpful too. If you want to look up flip your lid, it will give you a similar outline of how to talk about what is happening in the brain and what our role is. When I first started doing this work and started designing, thinking about how to talk about that, I realized that all of what I just went through is just really good basic practice. And so I started saying good practice is good practice. In other words, When you encounter a situation where someone is very different than you, that's coming to you and has a different framework for understanding your work, it's really important to stop yourself, take a step back, and think about slowing down and taking time rather than rushing through what the things that we normally can do very quickly with someone who has the same context, the same life experiences that we have. Good practice is that good practice. Stopping, taking time to explain things, not using big fancy language or acronyms for things, slowing down and describing things rather than using those colloquial terms that we use so often. Using language that is simple to understand, especially if you're interpreting or working with someone whose English is limited. Good practice is good practice, and I hope some of this helps you to think about new ways to approach refugees and refugee mental health.